When we talk about ideas of tradition or a tradition, people may frame what exactly tradition is quite incorrectly. What I would propose is that tradition in reality is a constantly evolving and developing thing in the context of a society where a society is constantly going through changes and reevaluating its fundamental ideas and assumptions about the world. And this can play out in very small things and in very big things. And something as simple as perhaps even just social customs and the way that people operate within a society, or something on a very large scale, such as the fundamental beliefs of that society and how it approaches the world. These things are constantly developing and constantly changing over time. And of course, the word tradition is a bit arbitrary insofar as it can relate to different things. For example, we can talk about an ethnic cultural tradition, we can talk about religious traditions, we can talk about more secular institutional traditions. But the point being is that within every society, within these various institutions and facets of that society, you will find different institutions. And the reality is that these institutions are constantly evolving and they are constantly developing. This actually goes against two popular assumptions which are present within certain groups of thinkers, perhaps, or society. One is to view tradition as essentially a static thing that prevents progress within society. And of course, those of a more perhaps progressive mindset may hold this view. On the other hand, you have the traditionalists who may view tradition as inherently good and especially within the context of certain religions, certain philosophical beliefs, perhaps, like let's say within certain faith traditions, they may view that, a religious tradition has been the same. It has been preserved from one point of time till another. And this unchanging, fully preserved tradition is a fundamental good and should not be altered. But the reality is that both the very traditionalist approach and the very progressive approach are both wrong. Because in reality, all kinds of traditions, whether they be cultural traditions, social traditions, or religious traditions, are constantly changing and constantly developing. And they undergo developments and changes in response to external factors and internal factors. So, for example, one point that I would give here is the example of religious traditions, more so theological traditions. Now, some people may view the theology of a certain religion as inherited, preserved, and unchanged from the founder of that religion till present times. And the more progressive elements of a society may believe the same thing, but they may think that that is fundamentally a barrier to progress. But in reality, in order to understand a religious tradition properly, our fundamental assumption should be that religions and religious traditions, by extension, are constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly developing. And these developments and changes can be traced quite, apparently, so to speak, and can be traced quite vividly throughout the course of the history of that religious tradition. For example, let's say in the course of Islamic theology, some people may view Islamic theology as having been, unchanged from the time of the Prophet till our current time. And, some people may view that as a barrier to progress because they think that Muslims have essentially preserved, or they just believe in the same exact beliefs, or they think in the exact same terms as that of 1400 years ago. And some people may view that as a good thing insofar as we have this tradition preserved directly from the Prophet. But the reality is that theology more broadly and our philosophical beliefs about the world are constantly changing and constantly evolving. And the Islamic tradition is no different insofar as the theological schools of the Islamic faith, whether you talk about the Sunni theological schools or the sort of Shia theological schools. So whether it be the traditionalist Sunnis or the Salafi Sunnis, or whether it be, let's say, the Twelver Shias or the Zaydi Shias, or whatever Islamic sect you could bring up, in reality, all of them have developed in terms of their theology, in terms of their philosophy, over the 1400 years of Islamic history. And they've had to respond to various challenges over the course of those years. And in fact, many of these schools of thought, many of these theological schools of thought arose not necessarily within the time of the Prophet Muhammad or his companions, but precisely as theological responses to certain external challenges to what could be considered an Islamic creed. For example, the Ash'ari school of thought arose kind of as a reconciliation between the reason-centric approach of the Mu'tazila and the revelation-centric approach of the Hanbalis or the Atharis. And you can see this within the biography of the founder, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, whose father, he was initially a sort of Sunni man, right? His father was a Sunni man who would hear hadith, who would attend hadith gatherings. But then eventually his mentor, Al-Jubba'i, was a Mu'tazili. And so Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari would be raised a Mu'tazili. He would become one of the most prominent Mu'tazili theologians in his area, in his vicinity. But eventually he recanted his Mu'tazili belief, and at one point he did try to play into the Athari school of thought, right? With his book Al-Ibana, which is a very controversial work of his that a lot of people dispute about, he tried to play into this Athari kind of creed. But eventually he came onto the methodology of Ibn Kullab and some of what you could consider the precursors of this kind of reconciliatory theology between reason and revelation. And so Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari formulates his school, the Ash'ari school, and this idea of reconciling reason and revelation, or that whatever revelation comes with reason confirms, this reconciliatory approach is very much a response to the debates about the role of reason and revelation in determining religious creed. And so you can consider how these developments are played out. And that's not just one development. Of course, the development of the Athari school, the development of the Mu'tazili school, the introduction of philosophy within Islamic creed, the reconciliation or the development of Avicennian philosophy and Ash'ari Kalam later on during the period of Al-Ghazali, for example. And then later Ad-Dawani comes along and he dissolves the supposed conflict between them. Point in case, all of these demonstrate the religious developments, the historical developments that have occurred within the theological traditions of these different schools within the Islamic faith. The same can be said about Christianity, of course. I mean, everybody knows, people who study the history of Christianity know about, for example, the councils of Nicaea, these various schisms, right? The development of the Catholic Church over the years, over the centuries, the rise of Protestantism and the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. All of this, right, is to show that these human developments, these historical developments have indeed occurred. And this idea of, no developments having occurred, or this kind of unchanging tradition from the founder till now, or this idea of religion being a barrier to intellectual developments or progress, is simply a false one. Because religion and in fact tradition, right? Tradition facilitates at times these developments. If not inherently, then at least with the way it engages with different challenges, the way it engages with different changes, the way it engages with different developments, intellectual or cultural or ritual, for example, and whatever you could consider to be so. And so all of these developments contribute to the development of said tradition. Of course, there are a number of examples I've given. For example, we can talk about the Islamic theological tradition, the Christian theological tradition, the various schools of thought that have arisen within these faiths. Another example of a tradition I may give is the modern West, or the various elements upon which it pulls. Of course, there's the Christian heritage, there's the Roman legacy, and there's the legacy of classical civilization, and there's the Germanic sort of spirit that's at play as well. And these various elements have given rise to the modern Western character. It's interesting to note how many of the ideals that the Enlightenment championed arise from certain Christian ideals about love and compassion. And for example, the ideas of liberty and individualism do arise from certain Christian teachings about man being made in the image of God, and hence the individual has fundamental rights and fundamental liberties as his own person, right? And he's not just subsumed within the collective whole. And of course, all of those developments, and many of those developments within the Western context, can be traced back to many Christian teachings and certain Christian values, so to speak. And so you can trace these developments within a tradition. Now, of course, there is some nuance here insofar as certain traditions can stagnate. I don't deny that. For example, within certain Asian cultures, many of their traditions stagnated or lost their dynamism, right? And this facilitated the sort of decline of many of those cultures, right? At least on a material, technological, and sort of economic level. And of course, with all the tragedies of, let's say, colonialism that occurred upon those societies. But the point is that tradition in and of itself can still be used and can facilitate intellectual developments. It can at times stagnate, and it can at times, become static, but it also does facilitate these intellectual developments. And what also makes this conversation more complex is that whilst in certain areas perhaps tradition can be a stagnant force, in other areas tradition can be very much a dynamic force. So for example, if we were to talk about the Islamic context, let's say, whilst perhaps in certain scientific or technological advances the Islamic tradition certainly stagnated, especially in the later eras, within the context of philosophical teachings or certain spiritual teachings or certain theological teachings, the Islamic tradition was still very much dynamic to a certain extent. And you can see how different philosophical ideas, different intellectual breakthroughs were still being made within the Islamic tradition, even despite what you may consider its more so technological weakness. For example, within these sort of Sunni schools of theology, especially the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools, important concepts were still being developed, such as discussions on free will and predestination. For example, the ideas of partial free will, which is a very important theological concept, were being developed within later eras of Islamic history, for example. Or, for example, the flirting with of certain Sufi philosophical ideas, such as those of Ibn Arabi, and the reconciliation of many of these philosophical spiritual ideas with the normative theology of Sunni Islam. These sorts of, developments were still occurring. And if you look, for example, within the context of Shia Islam, within the last century especially, Shia Islam has experienced a lot of dynamism and a lot of dynamic rigor. You can see this, for example, in the works of certain modernists like Ali Shariati, who developed his ideas of Shia Islam being a force for social revolution, for example. And even within Salafism, Salafism initially began as a kind of modernist revivalist kind of project which attempted to reform Islam. Of course, later on, Salafism became increasingly more what you could consider conservative and dogmatic as time went on, due to the incorporation of things like Wahhabism within it. But initially, Salafism very much began as this kind of reformist project. And so, whilst in certain areas, in certain sorts of disciplines, or in certain facets of society, these traditions may have some kind of weakness or they may stagnate. In other areas, they still may be very dynamic and they may allow for different intellectual breakthroughs to occur. So those are some nuances that are worth noting. But overall, I do think that tradition can facilitate intellectual development and intellectual breakthroughs. And oftentimes these developments arise from the principles within this tradition rather than breaking away from them. And so it's important to note the chronology of these developments and how some of these lead to others, how certain principles within a tradition lead to these developments, and to trace this kind of organic development of these various ideas and these various breakthroughs rather than viewing them as discrete historical events, so to speak.